Where's Dr. Skanes? Okay. Okay.
A landmark decision that stood nearly half a century, ensuring birthing people have the right to choose what they do with their bodies, has been overturned. On June 23, 2023, the Supreme Court released its controversial opinion in Dobbs versus Jackson's Women's Health Organization, ultimately dismantling the constitutional right to an abortion. With Roe decision now labeled egregiously wrong, the fight for reproductive rights has intensified. In Alabama, the fallout was swift. The 2019 abortion ban was implemented. Abortion clinics were sternly warned. But amidst this turmoil, grassroots organizers and advocates, especially from communities of color, have risen, voicing concerns about the societal impacts. Alabama, grappling with one of the highest maternal mortality rates, especially among Black birthing people, is now at the epicenter of this reproductive rights battle. From the streets to the courtroom, the fight continues. These unapologetic and determined voices remind us that the battle for reproductive justice is a battle for human rights. The fight is far from over. We will not be silenced. So join us in a discussion powered by It's My Body Period, an Alabama Values Initiative in collaboration with their reproductive justice partners, as we discuss where we are, how we got here, and the path forward in the fight for reproductive rights.
Hi, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. My name is Anisha Hardy. I am the Executive Director for Alabama Values. We are a grassroots communications organization that leverages the power of culture, media, visual storytelling to raise awareness around issues that are impacting our front door. And tonight, I am super excited about this timely and critical conversation around the fight for reproductive justice. At this moment, I'm going to bring on our moderator for this evening, Jenice. Jenice is the Executive Director for Yellowhammer Fund. And Jenice, take it away.
Thank you, Anisha. And I do want to say first, thanks to Alabama Values and Anisha for yet again facilitating another space for having conversations about reproductive health, reproductive justice, what's happening on the front lines. As movement folks, we know these issues often intertwine with other social issues. So the goal tonight is really to have a comprehensive conversation about the current state of reproductive rights in Alabama, particularly in the context of the recent shifts that have happened post-Dobbs and the implications that this has made on the ground and the connections to broader societal implications. So today we're joined by some visionaries in maternal health, Dr. Heather Skanes, who's on the front line and fiercely advocating for equitable healthcare in Alabama and beyond. She has firsthand experiences and insights that provide a unique lens into the challenges and triumphs of this movement. Each of them in their respective fields has witnessed the direct impact of policy decisions on real lives and have mobilized efforts to ensure that every individual's reproductive autonomy is protected. Her dedication reminds us of the importance of continuous advocacy and the power of collective action in shaping a more just and inclusive society. We also have Allison Zimmer, litigation counsel at the Lawyering Project, and lead counsel on Yellowhammer Fund v. Attorney General of Alabama, Steve Marshall, previously served as a Skanes Fellow and staff attorney at the Louisiana Center for Children's Rights, where she provided representation to students with disabilities in the juvenile justice system and litigated systemic education in youth prison condition cases. Wow. Some of that is new to me. I'm like, ooh, okay. Did anyone want to add anything to their bio before we jump into the questions? Dr. Skanes, I know your reputation is like you can't get it into just the call, so you want to add, because I know I missed some things. So I know you're a whole revolutionary in the state.
Are you talking to me?
Yes. Did you want to add anything to your
No, I think you did a great job. I think you did a great job with the bio.
So let's get into it then. Dr. Skanes, I know you provide a broad range of OB/GYN services. Since the overturning of Roe, have you seen a change in the choices women are making about their reproductive health? And how has the healthcare landscape changed for reproductive rights, especially post-Roe?
Oh, absolutely. We're seeing a change. I think initially I had patients that were coming in that were like, okay, I'm 20, but can I get my tubes tied? Like, I don't want to have any kids. Like, of course, we saw an uptick in vasectomies, like things like that. But overall, the biggest impact that I'm seeing is that when you have somebody with an undesired pregnancy, it's very hard for us to counsel them the way that we used to be able to counsel them before. You could have that conversation about like, well, hey girl, you have options, but we can't have that conversation anymore. In Alabama, people are very limited in what they can do. And so that's really hard to have that conversation with people, especially given the traumatic ways in which some people become pregnant. I think the other thing that we're seeing is that patients just feel like patients and providers feel like they're not heard. There are, of course, many medical reasons in which we might choose to terminate pregnancies. And, as a provider, that's the best thing for your patient, and not being able to offer that is so incredibly frustrating to me as a provider, but also to the patients when they're like, well, if this is the right thing for me to do and I have XYZ condition, why can't I get it? So it's been incredibly frustrating.
You said something that really stuck out to me. One, that there is an uptick in vasectomies. So that's like something I kind of want to circle back to. But also, what is counseling someone that you have to tell, hey, you don't actually have options? What is counseling someone through a birth that they didn't necessarily desire look like? That sounds really emotionally taxing.
Oh, it can be. And I've had people break down in tears, and then you end up spending upwards of an hour talking to people, about, what may have happened to them. And I think one of the things, of course, I'm a physician, right? So I'm not an attorney, but one thing that happens to us as physicians is we feel like we're going to be penalized. So a lot of physicians may not even have that conversation, period, because they feel like, well, if I advise them in any way in termination, that I'm going to be somehow liable. And we shouldn't have to feel that way. I should be able to just educate you, period. But I noticed that was an issue. The second issue that we had is then the law becomes hospital or medical policy rather than the reverse, right? The medicine should drive the decision making, not the law. And so that became a huge issue with our department discussing, okay, well, what if people come in this scenario or that scenario, then what do we do? And they're giving us, oh, well, our policy is going to be the Alabama law. That doesn't make sense, and it doesn't address all the various scenarios that we had. But I think on the individual level, I've had several patients who came to me and said, this pregnancy occurred for XYZ reason. I can't be with this person for XYZ reason. This is the thing that's happening to me. I can't afford to go XYZ place. And now here I am with this pregnancy and no help. And I can think of at least 3 people off the top of my head where that has happened to recently. And it's just frustrating. It's frustrating to watch people because really and truly, once you have that baby, it's very limited resources out here. Like, yeah, you have some assistance with food, but where are you going to stay? And who's going to help watch your child while you're at work that you didn't even want to have anyway? So it's frustrating.
It's like, but when you hear people reiterate it from a different perspective, it's a lot. Allison, I'm hearing Dr. Skanes talk about how she's unable to give information that she knows well, that she is well versed on, that people need in dire moments. Can you give us a brief overview of the lawsuits against the Attorney General and talk to the impact that it has, those threats that he has made against people that are assisting folks in providing care?
Yeah, absolutely. So I work at the Lawyering Project, which brought one lawsuit. There were two lawsuits that were actually filed on the same day. At the Lawyering Project, I'm not the lead counsel on the case. Jamila Johnson, our wonderful senior counsel, is the lead counsel, and I'm really lucky to be part of that team. But both of the lawsuits are challenging threats that the Attorney General of Alabama made, threatening to prosecute people who provide support to a pregnant person in Alabama who's seeking lawful abortion care in another state. So we know that there are many states in the country that have not banned abortion, and that our constitutional right to travel, our constitutional right to free speech, all of those things should and do protect the right to access that care. But the Attorney General is upending that understanding of the Constitution and threatening to prohibit that sort of assistance. So the lawsuits are challenging those threats and making a really clear statement that this is not okay. Despite Dobbs, despite the overturning of Roe, we still have the ability to travel and to access care and to support our friends and our neighbors in accessing the care that they need. And I think that one of the things that's so harmful about these threats is really what Dr. Skanes was saying about the chilling impact that those threats are having. So we hear from doctors in states across the country that say, am I even allowed to say the word abortion? Am I even allowed to, speak about options to my patients? And that's, of course, interfering with the patient-doctor relationship. It's interfering with healthcare and the ability for people to make their own decisions. And it's creating so many restrictions on options for people that used to have options and now are not sure where to turn or where to go. So I think it's disconnecting. These threats are really intended in a lot of ways to create chaos and confusion and chilling of speech and disconnect people from their communities, because that was where people need to go and turn to get the assistance and support they need. So the lawsuits are really intended to send a strong message that this is not constitutional, both sending that message to the Attorney General of Alabama that he can't make good on these threats, but also to other states across the country that this is not something that can be criminalized, and that we still have the right to travel for the healthcare we need.
Oh, Alabama. Dr. Skanes, I find myself having conversations with people that so often look like me being exhausted trying to explain how this is a death threat to us, folks that can birth in this state. There's always, oh, Jenice, well, that's a little extreme, or it's not really that much of a threat because that just means you have to carry a pregnancy, completely ignoring our maternal mortality rate, completely ignoring like what little options we have to like advocate for ourselves, even in birthing. Can you tell me more about the midwifery bans? Because I find myself trying to get people to connect that like the abortion ban means we don't have access to abortion care, which means some people are going to birth. Not everybody's going out of state. That's not how Alabama works. Some people have never left the state, much less leave for abortion care. So adding that extra layer of like effectively not allowing midwifery care or birthing centers, can you talk to us about that and what effect it has on your community?
Right. So as you kind of alluded to, all of these things are interconnected when we look at the landscape of just women's health and women's ability to make decisions. You have, on one hand, these people saying you cannot decide whether or not you can maintain a pregnancy. You can't decide that. We're going to decide that for you. And yes, you have to continue with the pregnancy, no matter the risk to yourself. And then on the other hand, not only will you maintain that pregnancy, but you're going to give birth with who we think you should give birth with, where we think you should give birth. And I think that should bother people. And I don't understand why people aren't bothered by that. Like so many levels, we as Americans pride ourselves on our ability to have this freedom and to make, we're a free country and make choices. Why does that not apply to women? Why is it that we think that women don't have the ability to make these types of decisions for themselves with regards to any of their reproductive rights? And if you call yourself someone who is, you know, pro-life per se, which really you're just anti-abortion, but if you call yourself someone is pro-life, why would you not then take it a step further and protect women's ability to choose how they bring life into this world? So that's how you see that it's really not about abortion. It's really about limiting what women can do and what choices women have. And then, of course, as you know, this is going to disproportionately affect Black and brown women.
I think one of the misconceptions people often have about birthing outside of hospitals is that it's unsafe. It's like, well, we just want women and TGNC folks that can birth somewhere that's safe. And they like parrot this because people don't have enough time to do research or to like be really well informed. And I know you had a birthing center. Can you speak of the success of the birthing center and the differences of that and like medical care in Alabama?
Absolutely. I think that is a very common, but also an intentional misconception that is put out there that this is something that is unsafe. I think that you have to realize that over the vast majority of human history, women or birthing people gave birth outside of the hospital. It's actually a relatively new phenomenon that people gave birth inside of the hospital. And that's not to knock Western medicine. There's certainly a place for Western medicine and for hospitals in the role of caring for women who are birthing or people who are birthing. But it's not something that is for everybody. And it doesn't have to be. The vast majority of people giving birth are low risk. And so giving birth outside of the hospital is actually safe for many people who are low risk. And it's actually a very reasonable choice, which is why we developed the birthing center, especially because as the years have progressed, women of color have expressed a number of concerns with hospital treatment. And many women over recent years have begun to look for other options. And that's why birthing centers or out of hospital birth is such an important option. It's just a safe space for people to give birth. And people choose this for a number of reasons. But the biggest thing is that it's a choice, right? Hospitals will still be there. You know, we're not saying that everybody has to have their baby outside of the hospital, but it is a woman's or a person's right to choose what is the best for them given their history. I think she said there's a question.
Looks like Jenice dropped off. I'm happy to try to answer this question from Freya about providers providing information about options. You know, what the Attorney General's threat said is that providing this information could be prosecuted as a conspiracy. So the Attorney General has threatened to prosecute anyone who is agreeing with someone in the state of Alabama to give information or provide support to someone to access lawful abortion care. We very much believe that that is protected information, that it's a matter of the First Amendment. It's protected by free speech rights. But that is very much like gets to the heart of the problem with the Attorney General's statements that it is, you know, we talk about control and how all of this is about control and controlling people's choices. Not only, you know, is it controlling the choices you can make in a moment, but I think he's also now trying to control the information that's available to people. And that is a tactic of control and making it harder for people to find information. And we know, you know, it's so difficult already to access abortion care. The map of where you can access abortion care is constantly changing because the laws are constantly changing. But for pregnant people in Alabama, you may have to travel hundreds of miles, and that requires a hotel. It might require childcare if you have children at home that need care while you're going to access your appointment. It might require a bus ticket or even a plane ticket. You might have to miss work to do that and miss out on the income you would have made during that time. So all of that, requires support. And by limiting the ability of groups to provide information and support, it is really effectively limiting choice for people in Alabama. So that is the threat of these harms, or the harms of these threats, the real challenge with what the Attorney General is doing. But yes, absolutely, there are serious constitutional problems with him doing that. So that is why we are going to the courts and seeking relief in that way. Hey, Jenice.
Hey, yeah.
A human right is what she's saying.
Yeah. So I mean, I think access to information and the ability to share that information is a constitutional right. I think it's a human right as well. I think that I think that framing makes total sense. And that is, again, why we think these threats are unconstitutional, and why we think we have a really strong case in court. But I think it's not. It is a targeted choice, I think, on the part of the Attorney General to limit access to that information, because it limits people's ability to provide care and support to their community members, and it shuts people in need of help off from those resources.
The other thing you mentioned, Allison, was how far people travel to get abortion care. And I also just want to draw a parallel to the fact that there is such limited prenatal care within the state of Alabama, period. So not only would people have to drive a significant difference to get an abortion care, because I think there was like 2 or 3 places they could go, but there's only a couple of places that offer labor and delivery services in the state of Alabama as well. And so people would have to drive significant distances, because like many southern states, Alabama is largely rural. And but now you're having to make more than one trip, because I have to go every month, then every 2 weeks, then every week, versus I'm taking, this one-time trip because I can't afford to have a baby. Now I can't afford to have a baby. I don't have transportation, and I got to drive. I got to figure out some kind of way to get someplace once a month.
Dr. Skanes, something I find myself also repeating. Can y'all hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Repeating into exasperation is the importance of supporting more work than just abortion-centered work. In the state, I've been saying this since pre-Dobbs, post-Dobbs. I think one of the misconceptions I had with the Dobbs decision was that people would really reckon with birthing in the state, like they have to reckon with like what people were facing after carrying a pregnancy, whether it was a wanted pregnancy or not. But what we actually saw in real time was a lot of folks pivot to supporting folks that can get out of state for abortion. And so it still left out the most marginalized folks, most people that needed care in the state. What does advocacy look like for pregnant folks now for you with those limited options? And is there any amount of collaboration you're having to do? What does taking care of people look like in a post-Dobbs role for AOB?
Of course, we try to stay abreast of what's going on, like what options people have, still wanting to provide, basic information, because like you said, this is medical information, this is protected. So of course, still providing education. Of course, now trying to really put that emphasis on before something happens, like, hey, that our state doesn't allow for this, that we have limited resources, if you do have an unwanted pregnancy, let's go ahead, let's talk about some prevention strategies, but also just really also trying to find more resources for the social aspect, because when you really consider reasons that people may be choosing to end a pregnancy, many times it's related to social issues. So reaching out and trying to collect those type of resources and advocating for support. And we talk about this. There's so many things that are wrong with women's health and the way that we treat people who give birth in the U.S. period, because if you want people to have babies, then you should be providing, maternity leave, right? That's paid. You should be not limiting people to 6 weeks. We should be providing resources for childcare. So I think there's lots of ways that you could advocate on this issue. But I think that, like you said, people kind of get stuck at this one spot.
What type of work is being done to interrupt the narratives around maternal health as it relates to Black folks that can give birth in the state?
That's a good. That's a good question. I think there's lots of work being done. You mentioned, I think 2 lawsuits that are coming about. There's other lawsuits that are going on to try to increase access and to advocate for birthing people. For me, one small thing that I try to do to change the narrative is I do try to put out positive images of Black and brown people birthing. Because we do hear so much about the healthcare disparities. I don't know about, you guys, but for me, as somebody of reproductive age, it is anxiety provoking. And to counter that, I like to put out positive images of calm, beautiful birth so that people just have something to balance it with, because there are people who are having great experiences. You mentioned the birth center. People were having great experiences in the birthing center. And hopefully we'll be able to return to that one day, but just putting out, images about the work that we're doing, because these things are possible, and just kind of reminding people that there is the possibility of change, and hopefully keeping people engaged in the community doing things like this, because we want the community to help us fight this fight.
I see that more than just putting out messaging and imaging, that y'all have also done community events that facilitate conversation, but also joyful post-pregnancy events. How do y'all come about doing that?
I get approached by, different organizations. One of the events that we did most recently that I think was very impactful was we did a community baby shower. And it can be very hard for people to say that I don't have what I need for my baby, right? That, because especially as Black women, you're supposed to be strong, you're supposed to have it all together, whatever. So having the community baby shower, we tried to make everybody feel special, like this, because everybody doesn't get a baby shower, and you don't really think about the fact that some people don't have family and friends who can buy them a whole bunch of stuff. But we gave everybody diapers, because you're going to need that. And then we put out new clothes, new and used clothes, and come get what you need for your baby. Of course, we had friends and family here. We talked to them about, birth and breastfeeding and all this kind of stuff. But I thought that was a really great event, just providing additional resources and additional support for them. And then, of course, we're planning on doing another event in this coming year, just to talk about some of the maternal health issues that are going on. But I thought that was a really good event.
Okay. I thought so too. I'm always online like, oh my gosh, Dr. Skanes is always doing something to facilitate joy. And I think it's like you said, it's a necessary balancing act. Allison, because we know all of these issues intersect, tell us about how your work with youth and disability, or maybe even prisons, intersects with the birthing or reproductive justice movement.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. So I spent several years before joining the Lawyering Project working with youth with disabilities, primarily on educational access. So working with youth in youth prisons across the state of Louisiana who were denied access to education. And I think one thing that that became very clear to me, especially now working at the Lawyering Project, is thinking about how so many of these restrictions on rights and restrictions on reproductive rights, it's ultimately about control, and it's about controlling people's choices. And I think when you really get down to it, it's about white supremacy. It's about people in power, historically and currently still white men, maintaining that power by restricting choice and restricting dignity and the ability for people to make decisions that are right for themselves and their bodies and their families. And I think that we see that playing out in so many other civil rights contexts. So whether that's access to education, adequate funding for education for students with disabilities or for students of color, or whether that's access to healthcare more generally, or access to housing. These should be basic human rights, but they're restricted and denied, I think, because of this desire to control for the people in power. And I think it's so important. I did some work in my former job advocating at the Louisiana legislature, and I would see, the same politicians, the same advocates that were fighting against rights and the expansion of rights. They were fighting to restrict access to abortion, or fighting to restrict funding for students with disabilities. Those were the same people that were doing work in fighting to restrict abortion. And I think sometimes we are very siloed in our thinking. I think the progressive community, the social justice community can be siloed. And I think it's really important to recognize that our opponents are not siloed. They are seeing these things as intersectional, which they are, and to fight back against that, I think we also need to be intersectional and recognize how, all of these things intersect and the same forces that are trying to restrict access to civil rights in so many different contexts are at work here. So I think that's one piece of it. I think I also have worked with clients in a number of different contexts. I've worked with children in school. I've worked with immigrants. I think it's very true that none of the clients I've worked with present with a single issue. So they're all facing the intersection of so many of these challenges. They're struggling to get access to the right services that they need in school. They're facing over-policing in their communities. It's difficult for them to access the reproductive health care they need. So individuals, we as people, do not experience these issues as siloed, and as advocates, I think we need to recognize that and fight back against those opponents in a really intersectional way too.
You said a lot, Allison. I'm over here like, yes, just because we don't get to live issue lives. Like maybe in a perfect world, we just have to fight one thing at a time, but that's never the case for marginalized folks. There's always these layers of marginalization. And I really think that's part of like folks get so used in the state to like adding on another layer of repressive legislation. It's like, well, Alabama's doing another thing. I just got to deal with it. So it's really nice to see people really, really fighting back in real time. Dr. Skanes, I think something I've noticed that we've done well is tie this movement around reproductive justice into the broader narrative of like Black Lives Matter. How do those things intersect for you?
I think that it intersects because, like you said, so much of this is not just one layer. It's how Black people or brown people are seen. And if your life is not seen as valuable, then your healthcare is not going to improve. Your reproductive rights aren't going to improve. And so we have to see life of Black and brown people being valued intrinsically, because if it did matter, then these things wouldn't be an issue. We would be talking about, we wouldn't be talking about how there's disparities in healthcare, because everyone's healthcare would be, the same, it would be equal, but it's not equal because we're not seen as equals. And, that, like you said, it's such a hard issue to tackle because there are so many layers, and because honestly people don't like to talk about white supremacy. It makes people uncomfortable. That's why they want to take it out of schools, because people feel guilty, instead of just addressing that guilt that you feel and moving forward with how can we make society better. I just don't want to talk about it, and that makes it hard for us to get to the root of these things and to really improve our outcomes.
Thank you. Allison, I've noticed a trend with blue states versus red states, and the blue states think, despite whatever is going on in Alabama and other southern states, that they're safe. How would you reply to someone who thinks like, oh, we're safe, we're in a blue state? How do these things still impact us or them?
So I think we saw this really clearly recently with the lawsuit challenging access to mifepristone, which is one of the drugs that's used in the most common medication abortion regimen. And there's a lawsuit to challenge the FDA's approval of that drug, not limited to a specific state that already bans abortion, but that would be a national. The people who are filing that lawsuit and litigating that case are seeking national invalidation of mifepristone, and more broadly, probably of medication abortion. So I think it's really important to recognize that these threats are national, that they're not limited to southern states or to states that already ban abortion. I think, this is still very much in flux. We're seeing this play out in legislatures across the country. And I think, as part of that, I think it's just so important that I saw a lot of narrative after Roe, this idea that, or after Dobbs, after Roe was overturned, the idea that, people that live in blue states will be safe, and that will always be available and people can travel. And we have to continue to fight for that. And we need to, I think ultimately it just underscores for me that we need to build back in a way that's much more robust than Roe ever was. And I think that's, the very, very long-term goal of the Lawyering Project is to create something, better in its place that truly centers racial justice, that truly centers economic justice, and recognizes that these issues are so intertwined. Because I think otherwise we get into this space where we have, individual states in this patchwork of legislation that's unstable, and where, we are only, our rights are only as strong as the rights for the most marginalized among us. And that means that we have, so limited rights at this point, and we all need to be fighting and see this as all of our fight. And I worry that narrative can undermine that truth.
I'm going to take a question from the chat from Zephyr. Zephyr said, I used to work at a medical answering service where we took most of the incoming labor calls and relayed them to labor and delivery at hospitals across the state. I knew beforehand that access to birthing services in Alabama weren't great, but I was floored by how many people were driving 2+ hours, birthing on the side of the road, etc. How has Roe being overturned exacerbated this for folks who are having a wanted pregnancy? How is this affecting our already struggling hospital birthing systems?
I think this is such a good question, because I think that the people who make these rules don't really understand how overburdened the hospitals are currently. It's not just about having enough beds for people, but that is an issue, having enough beds. But you got to have people to work too, right? So you have to have nurses that can work. You also have to have physicians or midwives who can work, and people can only do so much on a shift, before they start. I mean, how many days can you be awake before you get an attitude? If you think about it like that, consecutive days that you're just awake, taking care of people before your demeanor changes, before the level of care changes. And, we have, certain things that, hospitals try to do to address this, but overall, there's really no great system in place. There's no certain number of hours that physicians can work. You can work until you fall dead. There's no work limit. There's no work hour limit. There's no set number of patients that a physician can take, which means that the hospital is going to run you into the ground, right? These systems are really built on capitalism. They are not built on humanism or making sure that people get the best care possible. And I think that this is coming to light now. It's just all coming out.
Dr. Skanes, I wonder with this overworked question from Zephyr, I noticed a lot of people really being more cognizant of Black OBs in the last year and a half. And I'm not even going to lie, Yellowhammer Fund is also a group that will go out and be like, go to Dr. Skanes, go to Dr. Allison. How is that impacting? Do you think people were more cognizant of who for their care? And do you think y'all have been able to scale?
I definitely think so, but I think that one is so tricky. I think there's definitely, it's just kind of like with people choosing a man versus a woman. Some people are definitely going to go to a Black OBGYN because they feel more comfortable, as a Black woman, that I'm going to be heard. But when I tell you that sometimes we're our own worst critics, and that there are people, that I see on message boards that are Black that will specifically say, I want a white person. I want a white physician, which is, it is what it is. But I think, as these things have come to light, I mean, there's also studies that show that people of color have better outcomes when they have a physician of color. But I think that as these things have come to light, people have started to be a little bit more cognizant of it and trying to pick providers. But I can't say that it's been a huge shift.
One of the things that I've talked to a few people about is the way that which people talk about the like medical exception, like, oh, there's this exception if your life is at risk for your pregnancy. And I find myself trying to explain to them that that doesn't function in the way that people think it does. Like, it's not like this thing that is happening right after you need it, timely, and, you know, before it can cause any other health issues. Can you talk about the ways in which the medical exemption functions in like an actual hospital setting?
It is terrible because for some people, and because you have to have two physicians that agree, right? For some people, that means you have to physically be dying. You are on your deathbed if we are pumping blood into you, right? For some people, that's what that means. So if you're not there yet, that means, ma'am, you can sit here, you can wait it out. I don't want that kind of healthcare, right? For me, it means that if the risks of maintaining the pregnancy are more than the benefits of maintaining the pregnancy, then the pregnancy should be terminated. That's me. But if you're a physician, now I got to sit here and look for the ops, right? So now I'm like trying to figure out who thinks like that, you know, because I got to find a second person to agree. And I will tell you the most common time that this comes about is when people's water breaks early. It's not viable, right? So like if you are 16 weeks and your water breaks, technically your baby has a heartbeat. The baby's 99.9% of the chance that it ain't gonna live, right? So for some people, that means we have to wait for you to get septic and be dying. That's silly. Before this happened, I could have a discussion with the patient about like, hey, very strong likelihood that this is a wrap, right? We can do nothing and we can see what happens. We can give you a medicine and help you proceed on. We can do a procedure and help expedite the delivery, or, you know, and then if you don't do anything, here's the risk. You might become septic and die, or you might become septic and develop clotting, you know, and what have you. And people made that their own decision about what they wanted to do. And I will tell you, the vast majority of women would say, I want to terminate this. That's the vast majority of women. Now, every once in a while, you'll have somebody who's like, absolutely not. But that was their decision to make. You know, if some of you have other kids that are alive and well, you know, or you may have things that you want to accomplish without children. I mean, you shouldn't have to be on your deathbed to receive the necessary care that you need.
Oh, I'm sorry, y'all. I'm comprehending the having to be septic to get the care you need. Because I can imagine being firsthand. Like, it's enough to hear it and feel like, oh, that's a lot. But just to be the provider that actually advocates for your patient's needs and still have to wait or get another opinion as a professional because of someone that's not a medical professional deciding.
Right. And it's hard enough, you know, as a patient, when you hear something like that, it's already devastated, right? You've already, you know, had to cope with the fact that this is happening to you, because for some people it was a desired pregnancy. And then for somebody to be like, and now I just got to sit here, you know, it's like torture.
It is torture, and it's risky.
Mm-hmm.
And I think so much of this reveals, like, none of these laws are written by doctors or written with doctors consulting. They're written by politicians, anti-abortion politicians. And that's in so many ways, I think, why we see, in part, why we see a mismatch between what actually happens in, you know, patient care and what the laws say. And it's really difficult to figure out what that line is because of that. And I think what we end up seeing then is doctors being terrified of stepping in because the risks are so significant. The prosecution, the risks of incarceration are just so lengthy. And I think the other thing is we see in states, you know, Louisiana, where I live, for example, has a medical futility exception, which many states don't have. So they say if the pregnancy is futile, and there's a list of pretty specific conditions that count as medically futile, the pregnancy can be terminated. But even despite that list and despite that exception, doctors are scared to provide an abortion in that context because it's still not entirely clear under the law and the risks are so severe. So I think, we know these exceptions are in name only. They're really not at all a solution to this problem. And even when they're written down in that way, people are denied care.
Allison, wow. How do you think folks' socioeconomic standing impacts their ability to advocate for themselves and exercise their rights in this state, but in this country?
Big question. Yeah, I mean, I think in this context in particular, we were talking about all of the hurdles that people have to overcome in order to access abortion care, particularly if they live in a banned state, but not only if they live in a banned state. Even in states where abortion is lawful, it can be really difficult to get an appointment. You might have to travel very far from where your home is. And these things are costly, and so many people don't have days that they can take off from work. They might lose their job if they have to take off for an unexpected medical appointment. So all of these barriers, I think, are just making it incredibly difficult for especially people who struggle financially and who are living paycheck to paycheck and really to put what they need together to access care. And I think, more broadly, I think thinking about advocacy more generally, we know that I think there was a question previously about voting and how barriers to voting are I think obscuring the politics in our country. And I think, Jenice, you said this really well in an interview you gave recently, how people are constantly discounting the South and discounting Alabama and saying, Alabama has an abortion ban because people aren't fighting for their rights in Alabama. And we know that that's not the case at all for so many reasons. One of which is that there's a targeted effort to deprive people, and particularly Black people, of their voting rights, and that is making it incredibly difficult to change the laws. And there's serious gerrymandering, and all of these things I think are disproportionately impacting Black communities, but also low-income communities, and that is making it increasingly hard for people to advocate for their rights and to access the care that they need and the services they need.
Yeah, we hear the voting.
I was going to say the other thing about that is it's not just as simple as move to a blue state or whatever. There are people who feel a certain way, who feel that way, that these things should be available, who live in Alabama. There's a lot of people who feel that way. It's just that we don't necessarily have the representation when it comes down to making these laws. And so I think people are just well, why don't you just move? Well, why should I have to? Why should I have to? If my family is here, my legacy is here, why should we have to give up anything? Because to me, it's simpler. If you don't want to have an abortion or you don't believe in abortion, don't go get one. That's easy.
Easy math. Simple math.
Right? Done, right? And then the people who don't feel that way, they still have their ability to do so. And it shouldn't be on us, or we shouldn't be penalized or thought negatively of just because some people have chosen not to move forward in this state. And I think that happens so frequently with just Alabama. When you think Alabama, people are always oh, it's so backwards down there. It's there's lots of revolutionaries down here. We're just not getting heard.
Or funded. There's so much of that toxic thinking, even in pro-choice spaces, of well, if people would have just voted. And I had to tell a lot of people that come into the state, we don't want to freaking hear that. until you like have a full spectrum conversation about racial gerrymandering, until you have a conversation about people's real-time needs not being met, so much so that they can't fathom getting out to go do something that they don't feel is going to in turn give them anything back, I don't want to hear it. The state's not feeding anyone. The state is not housing anyone. The state is not adequately birthing Black and brown. We don't want to hear it. I'm not going to go off on a tangent about it. Next question. Before I go off on my tangent, why now? What's the importance of this moment?
Why now? I think that basically we have reached a point in which people, but especially people of color, are now demanding what is owed to us. We have given so much to this country, to this state, and we are owed things in return. Basic rights. I don't think we're asking for a lot. Nobody asked for $1 million. We are asking to be able to go to places, receive the medical care that is appropriate for us, and for the ability to make decisions regarding our own health without interference from the state or from the government. I don't think that's asking too much. And I don't think that we can continue to wait and think that somebody's going to do something for us. There is no savior coming to help us in Alabama. We got to do it ourselves.
Yeah, I think that's incredibly well said. I think, you know, in the context of what the past year and a few months has looked like since Roe was overturned, you know, I think we should all feel extreme urgency in this moment, because every day that goes by where we're living under these threats of prosecution, we know that people are denied care, people are being forced to carry pregnancies to term that they don't want to do. They don't want to carry pregnancies to term. And I think that is a tragedy on an individual level, of course, for everyone that's going through that. But I think, you know, we need to be acting urgently to stop this from happening and to stop the constant erosion of our rights. I think there was so much rhetoric after Roe was overturned that, you know, even in the opinion from the Supreme Court, like, we're just returning this to the states. That's all this does. And we know that that's not what they ever wanted. We know that they're going to constantly continue to erode rights until, you know, their goal is to overturn abortion nationally. So we have to stay vigilant. I think that's incredibly important. And we're seeing wins. We're seeing that you know, the messaging from anti-abortion folks is not succeeding. They are going to continue to try to get their legislation passed by continuing to gerrymander and continuing to, you know, restrict access to the polls. But we need to remain vigilant and continue these conversations, you know, like at every single level, whether it's with your friends or, you know, conversations like this or in the courts, because that's the way to really affect the change that we need now.
Allison,
do either of you know, like, how much money people invest into lobbying against abortion? Because I just imagine that the millions and millions of dollars that they spend doing this, that we could be actually like helping people.
There's so much money just in funding crisis pregnancy centers right now. It's like an absurd amount of millions. And I learned the other day, I can't remember what the number is, but it is infuriating, the amount of money, because crisis pregnancy centers are anti-abortion centers.
And they only see like 2 to 3 people a day. Like, so imagine if you had put that money into like actual women's health, like what we would be looking at. Maybe people, or into resources for people who have children. Maybe people wouldn't even be looking at abortions like that. Like, oh, I have everything I need when I have my baby. like this, the outcomes could be so different. It's amazing to me.
It does let us know, though, that like looking at how much the state funds everything but, it makes me firmer on my stance when people are like gifting them ignorance. Like, well, maybe if they just knew, we got to give them another sob story. Maybe if we just told the story this way. No, they know. Just like we know, they know they have access to everything they need. And when they need an abortion or when they need to birth, they're going to be able to do it. If they got to fly to Cali, it's going to be nothing. They know who can't do that. They know we can't. They know our communities can't get up and go get an abortion in another state. And they don't care because it's our communities. And so when people keep saying, well, maybe if they knew, they know. So now what? They know it's an intentional threat. It's a threat on our well-being and lives. When do we address this as the threat that it is?
Absolutely. And we probably should just start referring to it as legislative violence, because that's what it is when it comes down to it. State legislators are trying to shift more funding instead of actual healthcare. Is there a decent level of awareness about fake clinics in Alabama? How can we inform and shift narratives?
So I think one of the most important things in reproductive justice work right now is folks funding, excuse me, outside of strictly abortion. That's my thing. When I say, okay, people need these resources post-pregnancy, like diapers, wipes, cribs, financial assistance, and folks say, oh, there's programs for that. Or there's someone even named a CPC in response to me. And I'm like, that's a harmful practice that we should not be subjected to. Somebody else has to do that work that has the mindset that we do of being pro actual autonomy, bodily autonomy.
Mm-hmm.
We have to support orgs that are actually going to do that work too. If we're only out here advocating for strictly abortion, nothing past that, nothing past birth, nothing postpartum, it's eugenicist in nature. We have to support reproductive justice work, and justice means that we are actually centering what people need. If I'm only going to support you as long as you terminate a pregnancy, then I don't have your interest at heart. That's not autonomous at all. So I think one of the things we do a lot is scream from every place that we can that it's necessary for us to do some of that work that crisis pregnancy centers are claiming to do around giving resources. It's necessary that we do that work and not them. It's necessary to have someone combating that harmful work that they do, or I can't even call it work, the harm that they do. It's necessary to have somebody else doing that resourcing. That's not them. That's not, you have to come in and pray with us. You have to tell us your life story. You have to tell us you're not getting an abortion. And most often, crisis pregnancy centers only serve the purpose of delaying you and getting to care. When I needed an abortion and I called them because they were her choice, right? Sounds like options. Mm-hmm. They only tried to delay me getting to abortion care. Luckily, I was just like, forget y'all. This is not what I thought it was. I'm out. But there's a lot of people that fall victim to that in real time. And it does push them past gestational limits to get an abortion. So it's a very harmful practice. And I think it's necessary to continuously call them out on it. On a final question, how can advocacy and reproductive rights be more intersectional, ensuring that the concerns of all races, genders, and classes are addressed and prioritized in the ongoing fight for reproductive freedom?
I think that is such a good question. And I think a lot of it, I think you kind of spoke to some of it in making sure that we are supporting all of these things that help people to be their best selves and have their healthiest selves. Making sure, finding out about different resources. So for example, as there's more progress made with transgender care, that has to be integrated into our practices and how we care for people who are transgender, who are giving birth. And before now, it wasn't as big, like the numbers weren't there to help people come up with standards. But now that it's becoming more and more people, or we're starting to see more and more transgender people giving birth, then we have to change the way that we practice and learn how to utilize the language and addressing all the concerns. So that's on us as providers and as people who want to provide resources to find out the information so that we can help people. I think, when we're looking at Black and Brown people, finding out why people are feeling mistreated, that onus is on us as providers to find out why people feel mistreated and what can we do to make sure that those things aren't continuing to happen. But also like this ongoing need to address the resources issue, domestic violence issues, housing issues. And, if we were being honest, if hospitals were not about capitalism, about humanism, there would be so much more initiative from hospitals to provide that level of care to make sure. Of course, we have, social workers and stuff in the hospital, but the level of resources that need to be provided to people is not there yet. And that's why I'm saying like our system has to be totally revamped and reintegrated if we really are about making the best outcomes.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I think, you know, from an advocacy and a legal perspective, I think it's really incumbent on us to center the voices of those who are most affected by these restrictions. And we know that that's Black women. We know that that's people of color generally. We know that that's low-income people, and that's by design. You know, I think as we've talked about a lot, because it is about, you know, controlling choices and restricting choices, but centering those voices and recognizing that people experience these restrictions in disproportionate ways based on their backgrounds. And, you know, as you said, I think, Dr. Skanes, I think people that are publicly anti-abortion, if they need an abortion, you know, there may be options available to them by virtue of their race, by virtue of their wealth and privilege, and we know that that's not true for everyone. And you know, being really, really clear and intentional about stating that, and because of that, you know, I think I said before, like recognizing that our rights are only as strong as they are for the people that are most marginalized in our communities, and we have to think about those people first when we're making choices about what to prioritize and advocate for.
I absolutely went over time, as I tend to do, but I think it's so necessary for folks to have these conversations that will regularly say we have to center marginalized folks. Marginalized folks are disproportionately impacted. Like, you hear the buzzwords all the time, and the funding never seems to go behind people's words. So how do people support your work, Dr. Skanes, and then Allison? How do we plug people in?
Of course, a very easy thing to do is you can follow us on social media at Dr. Skanes OB. You can follow Oasis Family Birthing Center on social media and follow our fight and advocate for us, and write to your legislators and let them know that you want birth centers in Alabama. You feel like it is a reasonable option for people, and let them know that this is something that is safe. You know, you can read on itself. You don't have to take my word for it. You can read about birth centers and the safety and effectiveness of midwifery care, but you can support our work by just letting them know that Alabama deserves birth options.
Yeah, and for Lawyering Project, you can visit our website, www.lawyeringproject.org, lawyeringproject.org. It's a little hard to say, to learn more about what we do. I think I'll put in a plug for the Abortion Defense Network. So anyone who has a legal question, whether they're a provider or seeking to provide support or funding for abortion, or a patient, can go to that website and get information, no cost legal services. And I think that that's a really important resource to help people learn about their rights and get the legal advice that they need. I know there was a question in the chat for me about advocacy, and I think that's you know, a great place to start, is to get connected to resources there.
Thank you all so much, Dr. Skanes. I see you're even at work taking this panel in true movement fashion, doing all the things at once. I really appreciate your work. I know it a little bit intimately, and I really appreciate what you do in our community wholeheartedly. And Allison, with the ongoing criminalization of pregnancy, I appreciate that work as well, because we can't afford legal all the time. We can't afford to fight back. And so it's so necessary. If anybody wants to plug in with Yellowhammer Fund, you can go on yellowhammerfund.org. We are doing a lot of creating safety nets post-Dobbs, and you can connect. You can come pack safer sex kits with us. You can come figure out who else you can support in this movement, like Dr. Skanes and Allison. Also, thank you to Alabama Values and Yashica Hardy. Please stay plugged with Alabama Values. It's the easiest way to know what's going on the ground in this movement space. And they're always really intentional about creating these spaces to have the conversations. Even with me, as a person that gets uninvited places a lot, they haven't uninvited me yet. Still. So thanks so much to Alabama Values and Dr. Skanes and Allison. It's been really nice talking to y'all. We can do it again.
Thank you for having us, Jenice.
Thank y'all for this.
Good night, everyone.
Hi, y'all.